The desert was silent except for the ticking of cooling metal. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the world was on fire. It was July 1942, deep in the Libyan night, and the sky glowed faintly orange, not from the moon, but from a dozen fuel depots erupting into flame. The men who caused it were already gone, swallowed by the dark. 10 British commandos on jeeps stripped of armor, led by a man who didn't believe in impossible orders. Major David Stirling, founder of the Special Air Service. Hours earlier, he had whispered the words that sent them into legend. "We hit them where they sleep." Now, they were racing across the dunes at 90 miles an hour, engines howling, tracer fire slicing the air around them like streaks of molten glass. Bullets whined through the night, kicking up fountains of sand. Corporal Evans gripped the Vickers gun, firing blind behind them. "They've spotted us," he shouted. "Let them," Stirling said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The fuel dump behind them exploded, the shockwave lifting the jeeps from the ground. Ahead, the desert shimmered with heat and smoke, their only path to survival. They had just destroyed over 40 enemy aircraft and a convoy of fuel trucks in one night, a raid every officer had called suicide, until it worked. The idea was born not in a war room, but in the middle of failure. In the summer of 1941, North Africa was an open graveyard of British ambitions. The Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel had driven the 8th Army back toward Egypt with terrifying speed, using mobility as a weapon, daring the British to keep up. Supply lines stretched across the Libyan desert like arteries waiting to be cut. Convoys burned. Airfields were bombed before dawn. And yet, in that chaos, one man saw something no one else did. Not another plan of attack, but a way to turn the desert itself into a weapon. David Stirling, a tall, quiet Scotsman from the Scots Guards, was convalescing in a Cairo hospital after a parachute accident had shattered his back. He was supposed to be bedridden. Instead, he spent his days sketching maps of enemy airfields and convoy routes, tracing the weaknesses no one dared to exploit. "We keep fighting Rommel head-on," he told the nurse once, "but no one fights him where he sleeps." He could hardly stand without a cane, but his mind raced faster than the tanks outside Cairo. His idea was as mad as it was brilliant. A small, highly trained group of men who would slip behind enemy lines, travel hundreds of miles through open desert, and destroy the German war machine from within: aircraft, fuel, communications, and anything that kept Rommel's army alive. It was an idea so far from military doctrine that it might as well have been treason. When Stirling first limped into British headquarters in Cairo to propose it, the sentries barely let him through the door. His uniform was unbuttoned, his boots half-laced, and his cane clattered on the marble floor as he made his way toward the map room. "Where's General Ritchie?" he demanded. The clerk looked him over, unimpressed. "You can't just—" "I can," Stirling interrupted. "Tell him it's about ending this bloody stalemate." He didn't wait for permission. Moments later, he was in front of General Neil Ritchie himself, standing among the brass and smoke of command. "Who the devil are you?" Ritchie asked, his tone half amused, half annoyed. "Stirling, Scots Guards. You're supposed to be in hospital." "I am," Stirling said simply. Then he laid out his plan. No divisions, no brigades, just a few dozen men moving fast, striking hard, and vanishing before anyone could react. A guerrilla force behind Rommel's lines. The officers exchanged glances that hovered somewhere between disbelief and laughter. "You're talking about suicide," one of them said. Stirling met his eyes. "Yes," he replied, "but not ours." It took weeks of persistence, a mix of charm and defiance, and one well-timed meeting with General Claude Auchinleck, the commander-in-chief of Middle East forces, before Stirling's vision became reality. He called it the L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, a name meant to deceive the enemy into thinking it was a large airborne division. In truth, it was 35 men, hand-picked misfits from across the army, paratroopers, engineers, scouts, even a few thieves. They were led not by rank but by nerve. Among them were legends in the making. Jock Lewis, a brilliant but haunted officer who would design the explosives that carried their war. Paddy Mayne, a former rugby player with a temper as explosive as his courage. Reg Seekings, Johnny Cooper, and Pat Riley, men who would follow Stirling through fire if it meant hitting the enemy where it hurt most. Training began in the wastes west of Cairo, where the desert stretched to infinity, and the heat was a living thing. Sterling drove them mercilessly, testing every limit of endurance. They learned to navigate by the stars, to move in silence, to fight without mercy. They practiced setting charges on mock aircraft, timing their runs to the second. Jock Lewis developed a new type of bomb, compact, reliable, deadly, perfect for slipping onto enemy planes. "It's not about brute force," Sterling told them one night by the campfire. "It's about precision. You strike once and the entire front feels it." Maine grinned through the smoke. "Sounds bloody fun to me." But their first mission nearly ended the dream before it began. In November 1941, the L detachment was dropped by parachute behind enemy lines during a sandstorm, aiming to hit Axis airfields near Gazala. The storm tore them apart before they even touched the ground. Parachutes vanished into blackness. Jeeps flipped in the wind. 2 men broke their necks on landing. Others were lost to the desert forever. Those who survived were scattered, blinded, disoriented. Sterling himself was thrown miles off course. When dawn came, the horizon was empty. No airfields, no men, just endless sand. The operation was a disaster. 22 men went in. Only a handful made it back. When Sterling stumbled into Allied lines days later, dehydrated and half delirious, he was told his unit was finished. "You've proven the skeptics right," a colonel sneered. "Your SAS doesn't work." Sterling stared at him, eyes hollow but defiant. "We just need better weather." What saved them was an unlikely alliance and the long-range desert group LRDG, a band of New Zealand and British adventurers who roamed the Sahara in modified trucks, mapping enemy territory and raiding supply lines. Sterling saw them as the perfect partners, desert navigators who could carry his men deep behind enemy lines and bring them out alive. The LRDG's commander, Ralph Bagnold, wasn't easily impressed, but Sterling's determination was infectious. "We'll take you in," Bagnold said finally, "if you promise to make it worth the risk." Sterling smiled. "We'll make Rommel notice." And so, under cover of darkness on December 17, 1941, Sterling's men set out again, this time by truck, not parachute. The desert was so vast it swallowed sound itself. Only the soft crunch of tires on sand marked their passage. They drove for hours under starlight, no headlights, just compass bearings and instinct. When they finally reached Sirte, the target airfield, the horizon glowed faintly with the reflection of floodlights. Sterling called a halt. "From here," he whispered, "we walk." The men moved silently through the dunes, each carrying a pack of Lewis bombs. The guards at the perimeter smoked lazily, unaware of what stalked them from the dark. Sterling signaled, a single hand movement, and his men split into pairs. They crept among the rows of aircraft, the metallic scent of oil thick in the air. One by one, they placed their charges beneath wings and fuel tanks, setting timers to the second. "Ready?" Lewis murmured beside him. "Ready." They withdrew into the dunes. Moments later, the desert night erupted into chaos, the airfield blooming into fire as fuel tanks ignited, planes leaping into the sky in sheets of flame. "That's for Gazala," Sterling whispered. By dawn, they were gone, vanishing into the desert like smoke. The Axis command woke to find 24 aircraft destroyed, 3 hangars reduced to ash, and no trace of who had done it. The Italians called it un colpo fantasma, the ghost blow. The British High Command, stunned, barely believed it at first. "Who authorized this?" an officer asked. "No one," came the answer. "They just did it." From that night on, the Special Air Service was no longer a theory. It was a weapon. Over the next months, Sterling's raids became the nightmare of Rommel's rear lines. Benghazi, Agela, Agadabia, every airfield within reach burned at least once. They destroyed planes faster than the Axis could replace them, hitting fuel dumps, convoys, even headquarters. Sterling himself often led from the front, his cane replaced by a Sten gun, his Jeep rigged with twin Vickers machine guns. Paddy Maine grew into a legend, brutal, brilliant, unstoppable, known for driving straight into enemy bases with guns blazing, laughing as he went. "You're mad," Sterling once told him. "Maybe," Maine grinned, "but it's working." By early 1942, the SAS had become the sharpest blade in the Desert War. Their success was measured not in territory gained but in chaos sown. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed, thousands of gallons of fuel burned, enemy morale shattered. Even Rommel himself admitted privately that the British devils of the desert were costing him more than any division on the front. Sterling, once mocked as reckless, now found himself reporting directly to Auchinleck. But he remained restless. "We've proven the idea," he said to Lewis one night, staring out at the stars. "Now we make it unstoppable." Lewis nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Unstoppable, maybe, but it won't stop taking from us." Weeks later, during a raid near Tobruk, Jock Lewis's Jeep hit a landmine. The explosion lit up the night like a second sun. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the man who had invented their bombs. Sterling stood over the crater for a long time, his face unreadable. "He built this," he said quietly. "We'll finish it." By mid-1942, the SAS had grown into a ghost army, small in number, immense in legend. They moved with the LRDG by day and struck alone by night, using the desert as both shield and sword. Their jeeps carried twin-mounted Brownings, jerry cans of fuel, and just enough water to survive. They painted the white SAS wings on their vehicles not for pride but defiance. "We're not hiding anymore," Sterling said before one raid. "Let them come find us." When they hit the Axis airfields at Sidi Hanesh and Fuka, it was more than sabotage, it was spectacle. Flames leapt 100 feet high. The desert horizon glowed for miles. German pilots returning from missions found their aircraft burning on the tarmac, their fuel depots gone, their comrades missing. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. The Luftwaffe began keeping planes airborne overnight, terrified of what might crawl out of the dunes. And through it all, Sterling refused medals, refused fame. "We're not heroes," he told his men. "We're professionals." But even professionals could not outrun fate. The Germans began to adapt, tightening defenses, laying traps, increasing patrols. The desert grew more dangerous with every mile. Yet Sterling pressed on, convinced that one perfect strike, one impossible raid, could change the course of the entire war. He began planning something so audacious it made his first missions look like drills. A direct assault on Rommel's logistics command at Bars, deep in Cyrenaica, defended by hundreds of men. When he presented it to his staff, even Maine stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely," Sterling said. "We go in fast, we go in loud, and we leave them wondering how the hell we did it." "They'll call it suicide," Maine muttered. Sterling smiled faintly. "Then we'd better make it worth dying for." The message arrived at dawn, its words typed in rigid block capitals on thin papyrus-light paper, carried by a dust-soaked runner who collapsed at the steps of L Detachment's desert camp like a broken animal. Major David Sterling read it under the pink light of early morning, the sun rising over the Jalo oasis in eastern Libya, illuminating the weary faces of 30 men who had already scratched their wills into the sand. The order was simple, horrifying. A night raid deep into the Axis rear, past the minefields, beyond the outposts, to strike at the heart of the Luftwaffe's supply chain. The intelligence estimated a convoy of fuel trucks and parked aircraft at Agadabia, and Sterling's superiors wanted it gone. They called it Operation Bigamy, though in the quiet corners of the desert it was already being dubbed the suicide raid. Sterling's jaw tightened. He looked around at his men, paratroopers, ex-commandos, desert scouts hardened by dust and fear, and said simply, "We go." No one asked. They had signed up for this. They left that night under a moon shattered by cloud, their jeeps coated in sand, their guns loaded, explosives strapped to axles, and their hearts hammering like desert thunder. The route took them eastward across the calcrete plains where the metric of time was not hours but bullets and mirages. The men drove without lights, headlights masked by filters, the roar of engines swallowed by dunes. A patrol crossed their path at 200 hours, 4 Italian muleteers pushing a cart laden with crates. Sterling held up his hand. The convoy halted. They bypassed the enemy without a shot, the only sound the hiss of tires leaving shallow tracks that would be gone by dawn. In the rearview mirror, the low ridge of the Agadabia airfield slowly crept into view, floodlights dim behind cloud. The tension was like a wire drawn tight, nerves frayed with every creak of the axle, the sputter of an engine, the breathing of men next to you. The order echoed in Sterling's mind. Destroy the supplies, destroy the planes, vanish before they can react. It sounded clear on paper. In the desert night, it translated into risk so high it could only be called madness. At 02:27 hours, Sterling signaled, "Stop." The convoy halted 50 yards from the airfield perimeter. The men killed their engines and sat in silence as though waiting for death. But this was their craft. Waiting, watching, daring. Captain Paddy Mayne inspected his 8-man team, crunching the sand under his boots. "Tonight we give them a memory," he said quietly, his Northern Irish accent ablaze in the darkness. His men nodded, faces set. Jock John Jock Lewis checked the explosives. Lewis bombs, cunning devices built for this moment. Each charge was timed to detonate at once to shatter the airfield into ruin. The men detached their lights, moved on foot through hidden tracks, the air still except for the distant buzz of a guard tower generator. The perimeter fence melted into blackness. They crossed it with boots silent, breaths held. Then the night exploded. They struck at 02:35 hours. The first explosion lit the cloud from beneath, a flame reaching skyward. The second charge sent a fuel dump sky high. Mayne's jeep burst forward with twin Brownings spitting tracers across plains parked like sleeping beasts. "For Gazala! For Libya!" he screamed, firing into aircraft and trucks alike. Sterling's jeep rode shotgun through the rows of enemy machines. Bombs snapping under wings, men sprinting, retreating, dying. The scene was hell made real. The ground shook. The smell of burning fuel mixed with torn metal and fear. Evacuations failed. Planes exploded. Mayne's reckless laughter cut through the gunfire. "Keep moving!" he barked as a crate of bombs detonated behind him, the shockwave lifting his jeep momentarily. The raiders fought on foot, hand grenades skipping across the tarmac, men diving for cover, then leaping up and firing again. In less than 12 minutes, the damage was done. Some 40 aircraft destroyed, fuel trucks turned to molten wreckage, hangars collapsed, command posts gutted. And none of the raiders knew whether they would see dawn. Withdrawal meant the desert again. And now the drivers had to escape with enemy anti-aircraft battery tracking their lights. Searchlights sweeping, flares popping like thunderheads, engines screaming over sand. 2 jeeps were lost, pinned down by machine guns. Mayne covered the retreat with 2 Browning footages, wild and unstoppable, bullets kicking up sand at his knees. Sterling pulled off his scarf, tied it about his wrist, his face grim, his back aching. Each bump of the jeep like a reminder of his hospital bed months earlier. The convoy staggered over the horizon. The dawn found them in the deaf silence of the Calcrete Plain, unseen for hours by enemy patrols. A few men collapsed. Others, shaking, laughed. Others stared at the sky, still hearing the echoes of explosions in their ears. They had done what no one believed possible. When the runners reached GHQ Cairo, the captured reports came in. Axis supplies disrupted, airfields vulnerable, their ability to support Rommel's forces reduced. The high command stared at the figures, truck tonnage destroyed, aircraft eliminated, morale crushed, and called the raid proof of concept. Sterling's command had become legend overnight, but the order he carried was the same one. Yes, this was suicide. And yet it had worked. In the hush of the desert dawn, Sterling walked among his men, dust-coated, boots unslicked, and said, "We are going to do many more." Mayne clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll go until they stop us, Major." The night's success changed doctrine, elevated the SAS into a weapon not of mass, but of precision and terror. Every officer's rejection of the idea was erased by the flame-lit horizon of burnt aircraft and silent trucks. The war's machinery, built on bulk and firepower, had been torn apart by a handful of jeeps, a crew of committed men, and a night that stretched into legend. In Cairo the next morning, cables were sent, promotions whispered, security tightened, but Sterling and his men were already gone again, blending into the sand, ready for the next impossible mission. And as the desert wind erased their tracks, the world realized the suicide raid was not a defeat waiting to happen. It was the edge of a new kind of war. By the autumn of 1942, the desert had turned from golden to gray, and with it the war. The victories of the SAS had spread like whispers across the front, legends of ghost soldiers who came in the night, burned everything in sight, and vanished without a trace. The Italians called them I diavoli del deserto, the devils of the desert. The Germans called them Gespenstertruppe, the ghost troop. But the men themselves simply called it the job. Now, the job had changed. The British Eighth Army, reforged, under General Bernard Montgomery, was preparing for the massive counteroffensive at El Alamein, the battle that would decide North Africa. Every gun, every tank, every gallon of fuel mattered. And in the shadow of that coming storm, Sterling received new orders that seemed to have been written by someone who'd never set foot in the desert. He unfolded the paper in his tent, the wind flickering the candlelight. "Intercept enemy reinforcements en route to Tobruk," it read. "Disrupt supply columns feeding Rommel's right flank. Expected casualties. Total." Sterling smiled faintly. "Total," he murmured. He looked up at Patty Main and Reg Seekings, who were waiting silently. "Guess we're famous enough now to die properly." The plan was as reckless as it was brilliant. Intelligence from the LRDG had mapped a network of German fuel depots stretching like arteries through the Jebel Akhdar Mountains, what the men nicknamed the Tentacles. If they could sever them, Rommel's armored divisions would choke before they ever reached the front. But it meant traveling deeper behind enemy lines than ever before, 500 miles through territory crawling with patrols, without radio contact, relying only on desert navigation and luck. They would move in 2 columns, Sterling's team striking the depots near Bars and Main's hitting the convoys on the coastal highway. "We'll meet at the crossroads," Sterling said, tracing the map with his finger. "If we're not there by the 3rd day, assume the worst." No one spoke. The desert outside the tent moaned like a living thing. "What are we calling this one?" someone asked. Sterling folded the map. "Call it Suicide, same as the last." They rolled out at dusk. 20 jeeps, stripped down, to bare essentials, engines tuned for silence, each carrying twin Brownings, jerry cans of fuel, and a coffin's worth of explosives. The men were leaner now, harder, their eyes trained by months of fire and loss. They drove in tight formation under a moon the color of bone, navigating by the stars Jock Lewis had once taught them to read. Every dune, every ridge, every shadow could hide an ambush. The silence between them was a pact. Nobody would be left behind. The radio crackled only once during the entire first night. "How's your end?" Main's voice came through, half static. "Quiet," Sterling replied. "Too quiet." A pause, then laughter. "Wouldn't have it any other way." By the 2nd day, the heat was unbearable. Mirage after mirage shimmered on the horizon, promising water that didn't exist. The men's lips split and bled. Their tongues were raw from salt tablets. Diarrhea, sunburn, sand rash, enemies as deadly as any bullet. One man, Corporal Dean, collapsed beside his jeep, his skin the color of parchment. "Leave me," he croaked. Sterling knelt beside him, forced a canteen to his lips. "You don't get to die out here," he said, his tone quiet, almost kind. They hauled Dean into the shade of the jeep and pushed on. Every mile was earned in pain. Yet there was beauty too, the cold brilliance of the stars, the endless horizon that felt like freedom. "The desert doesn't care if you live," Sterling told his men one night as they rested, engines off, the wind whispering across the dunes. "But it notices if you don't respect it." On the 3rd night, they reached the foothills of the Jebel Akhdar. The terrain changed from open sand to rocky passes, the air cooler but heavier. They could smell civilization, the faint scent of diesel, sweat, and smoke. From a ridge overlooking Bars, they saw their target, a German supply depot lit by floodlights, trucks parked in neat rows, sentries pacing between fuel drums the size of houses. Beyond it, the faint outline of an airfield. It was the kind of place that had killed their friends at Gazala and Tobruk. Sterling studied it through binoculars, his jaw tightening. "We hit it at 200, he said. "No mistakes. In and out before they know we're here." Main, who had arrived via the coastal road, grinned. "I'll make sure they notice." At 2 in the morning, the night swallowed everything. The raiders descended from the ridge like phantoms. The first sentry never saw them. One swift strike, a silenced Sten cough, and he was gone. The men moved through the depot with mechanical precision, setting charges beneath every truck, stacking Lewis bombs under fuel drums, cutting power lines to plunge the camp into darkness. The air smelled of oil and sweat. Sterling's heart pounded, not with fear but focus. He glanced at his watch. 02:08. "Light it," he whispered. Patty Mayne grinned in the dark and pulled the fuse. What happened next defied description. The entire valley turned white. The explosion was not a sound but a force, a wave that rolled through bone and air alike. Trucks disintegrated, men were flung into the sky, flames spiraled 100 feet high. The desert wind caught the fire and carried it, feeding it with oxygen until the depot became a volcano of burning metal. The shock wave rolled up the ridge and knocked Sterling to his knees. He looked down at the inferno, at what his handful of men had unleashed, and whispered, "That's for Jock." They retreated before the enemy could organize, slipping back into the folds of the desert as confusion reigned below. Radio screamed in German. Searchlights slashed across the dunes. Trucks chased shadows. By dawn, the SAS were gone, but not everyone made it. 2 jeeps never reappeared at the rendezvous. Mayne found only tracks leading into nothingness. "We can't go back," he muttered, staring at the horizon. Sterling's face was unreadable. They knew the risk. The desert covered the rest. For 4 days they drove east, hunted now by half the Africa Corps. Enemy planes circled overhead, strafing any sign of life. The SAS jeeps scattered, weaving through wadis and dunes. A bullet tore through Sterling's scarf, grazing his neck. He didn't even flinch. One jeep overturned in the sand, killing its driver instantly. They buried him on the spot, marking the grave with a spent shell casing. "No names," Mayne said quietly. "Just men." The wind erased the mound within hours. They pressed on, fuel nearly gone, food long finished. By the time they reached the rendezvous with the LRDG near Kufra, they were down to 7 men. The New Zealanders stared at them in awe. "We thought you were dead." Mayne grinned, teeth cracked from dehydration. "So did we." The Bars raid would go down as one of the most daring in modern warfare. Rommel's supply network collapsed for weeks. Hundreds of vehicles destroyed, depots emptied, columns stranded. The Axis lines faltered at El Alamein, partly because of that night's flames. But the cost was high. Sterling wrote in his report, "Success achieved, casualties acceptable." What he didn't write was that he could still hear the screams from the fire, see the faces of the men who hadn't returned. He sat alone that night by the dunes, the stars cold above him, and thought of Jock Lewis, of the mad dream that had brought them here. "It's working," he whispered to the wind, "but it's killing us." In Cairo, when word reached headquarters, General Montgomery read the brief with a mix of disbelief and admiration. "Tell this Sterling fellow," he said, "that he's rewriting the rules." The SAS emblem, a winged dagger, became the most feared symbol in North Africa. New volunteers arrived daily, drawn by myth. "Who dares wins," their motto said. But in the desert, those words were written in fire and blood. Still, the victories could not protect them forever. The Germans had begun to adapt, laying traps, deploying faster reconnaissance, learning to think like the ghosts they hunted. Sterling knew the noose was tightening. Each raid was a gamble, each return a miracle. "They'll catch us eventually," Mayne warned. Sterling smiled grimly. "Then they'd better be quick about it." In early 1943, after months of relentless raids, the inevitable came. A mission near the Tunisian border, routine they thought, turned to disaster when a column of German armored cars ambushed their convoy at dawn. Sterling's jeep was riddled with bullets. The engine died in a cloud of smoke. "Go!" he shouted, waving the others off. "Scatter," Mayne refused. "Not without you." "That's an order," Sterling barked. The men hesitated, then fled across the dunes. Sterling crawled into the wreck, clutching his Sten, firing until the gun jammed. He was captured minutes later, dragged from the sand by paratroopers of the Fallschirmjäger. When they asked his name, he smiled faintly. "Sterling, Special Air Service. You've heard of us." The Germans stared. They had. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner in Colditz, escaping twice before being recaptured each time. Back in the desert, Patty Mayne took command. Under him, the SAS would evolve into something even more terrifying. a weapon that no longer answered to expectation, only to results. But that would come later. For now, the desert closed around them again, swallowing the tire tracks, the blood, the fire, leaving nothing but wind and memory. And somewhere in that endless sea of sand, the ghosts of the suicide raid moved still, unseen, unbeaten, and unforgettable. The capture of Major David Sterling hit the Special Air Service like a rifle shot through the heart. When word reached Cairo that the founder of the SAS had been taken alive by the Germans near Gabes, disbelief turned to silence. For hours, men sat around the mess tent without speaking. The desert wind whipped the canvas, scattering sand into their tea. Some refused to believe it. "He'll escape," someone muttered. "He always does," but Paddy Mayne said nothing. He stood apart from the group, arms crossed, staring into the horizon where the sun melted into the dunes. When a courier brought confirmation, Sterling captured, destination uncertain, Mayne folded the paper once, placed it in his pocket, and said quietly, "Then we keep going." There was no ceremony, no speech, no toast. Just the continuation of a war that no longer had its architect. In Sterling's absence, the SAS might have withered. Instead, under Major Robert Blair Paddy Mayne, it became something feral, more ruthless, more direct, stripped of the idealism that had driven Sterling's early missions. Mayne was everything Sterling wasn't: volcanic where the Scot had been calm, impulsive where he had been measured. A born fighter, a man who could drive a jeep one-handed through tracer fire while lighting a cigarette with the other. But beneath the violence burned loyalty, a brotherhood forged in chaos. Mayne gathered the surviving veterans in the ruins of a captured Italian fort at Kufra and laid out the new doctrine. "We've shown them what ghosts can do," he said, his voice echoing off the stone. "Now we show them what monsters can do." The unit was different now. Larger, better equipped, hardened by the lessons of the past 2 years. They had support from the long-range desert group, supplies from Cairo, even grudging respect from Montgomery's staff officers, though most still thought the SAS half-mad. Their missions, however, were now indispensable. With the Axis retreating west toward Tunisia, the SAS hunted them like wolves, raiding convoys, ambushing columns, cutting communications. They struck at night, vanishing before dawn, leaving nothing but wreckage and fear. German intelligence reports began to describe them not as soldiers but as bandits, men who moved without pattern, who fought without mercy. "These are not regular troops," one captured officer confessed. "They are something else entirely." He was right. The desert campaign was ending, but the SAS's war was not. Mayne's men were soon pulled north to prepare for a new theater, Europe itself. Yet before they left Africa, Mayne wanted one last strike, a message to the enemy that the spirit of Sterling was still alive in the dunes. The target was an airfield near Sfax, heavily defended but critical to the German retreat. Intelligence indicated that a squadron of Junkers transports and several Mi-110 fighters were being used to evacuate supplies and officers. Destroy them and Rommel's escape corridor would collapse. It was madness again, and Mayne smiled when he read the briefing. Then it's perfect. They moved out under a full moon, 20 jeeps loaded with ammunition and rage. The night air was cold and clean, the stars cruelly bright. "You ever think about Sterling?" one man asked as they drove. Mayne didn't look away from the horizon. "Every time we light something on fire." The laughter that followed was thin, nervous, human. They reached the airfield just before dawn. The Germans were awake, preparing to load their aircraft. Mayne raised his hand. Engines idled, guns ready. "We hit them from both ends," he whispered. No time to think. What followed became one of the most savage raids of the Desert War. The jeeps roared out of the darkness like wolves from hell, twin Brownings blazing. German guards scattered in confusion. Trucks exploded. Fuel drums turned into fireballs. Mayne's jeep crashed straight through the main gate, tires screaming, bullets tracing lines through the air. "Now," he shouted, tossing a grenade through a hangar door. The blast tore through the roof, sending aircraft parts raining like shrapnel. Within minutes, the entire field was a storm of flame and smoke. Planes tried to take off, only to be shredded by gunfire. A German officer ran out, waving his pistol. Mayne shot him without slowing down. "No prisoners," he growled. The team laid their charges, destroyed what was left, and vanished into the dunes before the enemy's reinforcements could arrive. By sunrise, the airfield was gone. When Mayne reported back to headquarters, the numbers spoke for themselves. 40 enemy aircraft destroyed, fuel depots annihilated, losses minimal. But the message was louder than any statistic. The SAS was alive and it was coming for Europe next. In April 1943, the North African campaign ended. Rommel had been recalled, his armies shattered. The Allied forces turned their gaze to Sicily and Italy, the next step in the march toward Europe. The SAS, reborn under Maine, was reorganized and expanded. Its men traded desert jeeps for parachutes and small boats, training for operations in terrain where every shadow hit a rifle. The transition was brutal. Many of the desert veterans struggled with the change. The sand, for all its cruelty, had been familiar. Europe was another kind of wilderness: forests, towns, civilians, uncertainty. But Maine was relentless. If the desert made us ghosts, he told them, Europe will make us shadows. Their first operations in the Mediterranean were small but precise, harassing German positions in Sicily, blowing bridges, ambushing convoys. But the SAS wasn't built to fight small wars. Maine pushed for something bigger, and soon he got it. In July 1943, the Allied invasion of Italy began. The SAS was tasked with leading deep reconnaissance and sabotage missions ahead of the main landings. They parachuted behind enemy lines disguised as local partisans, operating in conditions that made the desert seem merciful. Mud replaced sand. The cold was a living thing. The Germans were everywhere. In one operation near Salerno, Maine led a team of 6 men to destroy a communications hub in a small mountain village. They hiked for 3 days through rain and fog, sleeping in barns guided by Italian peasants who risked their lives to help. When they reached the target, they found it guarded by an entire platoon. "We'll improvise," Maine said, lighting a cigarette under his hood. They waited until nightfall, then struck, fast, silent, surgical. Grenades in the windows, submachine guns in the doorways. The fight lasted minutes. When it was over, the station was burning, the Germans dead or fled. The villagers emerged from their homes, some weeping, some cheering. One old woman grabbed Maine's arm and said, "Dio vi benedica," God bless you. He nodded, silent, the firelight flickering in his eyes. For all his violence, there was something deeply human in him, something the war had not yet managed to kill. As Italy fell, the SAS turned its eyes to France. The invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, was taking shape, and Maine's men were to be part of it. The new SAS units were divided between France, Belgium, and Norway, working with local resistance to sabotage railways, bridges, and enemy communications in advance of D-Day. It was a far cry from the open desert. Now they fought among hedgerows and villages hunted by the SS and Gestapo. Capture meant torture and death. But the men went anyway. Their motto, "Who dares wins," no longer just words but prophecy. In June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the SAS was already at work far behind German lines. They parachuted into forests under heavy fire, their chutes lit by tracer rounds. In Brittany, one group ambushed a German convoy for 3 nights straight, killing over 200 men without losing one of their own. In another mission, they blew up a train carrying ammunition bound for Caen, the explosion visible for miles. Yet success came at a price. Many were caught. Some were executed on the spot. Others vanished into the concentration camps, their names lost to history. But even in death, they tied down entire German divisions that might have fought on the beaches. Through it all, Maine moved like a phantom, never asking his men to do what he wouldn't do himself. He fought alongside them, bled with them, buried them. By late 1944, his reputation was mythic. The Germans had a nickname for him now, the Wild Man. His raids were studied at staff colleges, his methods copied, his name cursed by the Wehrmacht. But Maine himself had no interest in fame. One night after a particularly brutal raid in Belgium, he sat alone by a burning truck staring at the flames. A young lieutenant approached. "Sir, HQ says they want to put you in for the Victoria Cross." Maine exhaled smoke. "They can keep it." The lieutenant hesitated. "Why?" Maine's eyes never left the fire. "Because medals don't bring the dead home." The war was turning. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. But the SAS had become addicted to motion, to the edge. Even as victory loomed, they pushed deeper, daring fate with every mission. In the winter of 1944-45, they operated in the Ardennes, during the German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. Maine's men harassed retreating panzer columns, guiding American troops through blizzards, cutting off reinforcements. One night, trapped in a farmhouse surrounded by German tanks, Maine led a breakout under machine gun fire, killing 20 men himself with a Bren gun before escaping into the snow. When he rejoined his unit, his clothes were soaked in blood and ice. "You look like hell," one of his men said. Maine grinned. "Then hell's in trouble." By spring 1945, the end was near. Germany was collapsing. The SAS, scattered across Europe, had become a legend whispered in every ruined town. When Berlin finally fell, the men who had once crawled through the Libyan sand now stood in the ashes of the Reich. Sterling, still imprisoned in Colditz, would learn of it through a smuggled radio. He smiled when he heard the words, SAS units operating in Germany. His dream had survived. When the guns fell silent, there was no victory parade for the SAS. Their work had been done in shadows, in places where no cameras went, among men who lived by courage and died without headlines. Paddy Maine returned home a hero and a ghost. Sterling was freed soon after, thinner but unbroken. They met once more in London in a quiet pub. No reporters, no medals, just two men with too many memories. They didn't talk about the raids or the kills or the dead. They talked about the desert, about the silence between explosions, about Jock Lewis, about the mad idea that had started it all. When they parted, Sterling raised his glass. "Who dares wins," he said softly. Maine nodded. "And who survives remembers." Outside, the city lights glowed where once bombs had fallen. The war was over. But the shadows they had cast, ghosts born in sand and fire, would never fade. The war was over, but for the men of the Special Air Service, silence was an enemy they didn't know how to fight. The last rifles had been stacked, the last maps folded, the last orders signed. Europe was ash and ruin. In the streets of liberated towns, flags hung limp in the rain. The soldiers who had lived years on adrenaline suddenly found themselves back in rooms that felt too small, under skies too quiet. For men who had burned their way through North Africa, Italy, and France, peace felt alien, like a sound they could hear but not recognize. Paddy Maine sat in a small London flat that smelled of dust and whiskey, a single photograph of his men in the desert pinned above the desk. Their faces were young, grinning, half-burnt by the sun. Most were dead. He'd stopped counting long ago. The metal box on his table, distinguished service order with 3 bars, mentions in dispatches, meant nothing. They were relics of something he could no longer explain. When he closed his eyes, he saw the desert again, the shimmer of heat, the roar of engines, the laughter of Jock Lewis, the calm voice of Sterling saying, "We hit them where they sleep." He opened his eyes and found only the hum of traffic outside. For a man who had lived as a ghost, being alive felt like captivity. Sterling's return from Colditz had been hailed as miraculous. Thin, pale, and walking with a cane, he came home to a Britain that no longer understood the war he'd fought. The newspapers called him the Phantom Major. They spoke of daring raids and impossible odds, but not of the nights he lay awake in his cell, imagining the men still out there in the dunes. When he met Maine after the war, their handshake was brief, but the silence between them said everything. Two men bound not by friendship or rank, but by something deeper, a shared knowledge that daring had a price. They drank in silence that night, toasting the dead, then went their separate ways, Maine to Ireland, Sterling to Scotland. Both carried the same question unspoken: what happens to a soldier when the war he was built for ends? The SAS itself, their creation, faced erasure. Bureaucrats in London, men who had never seen a battlefield, considered the unit an anachronism, a wartime experiment with no place in peacetime. "The age of raiders is over," one general said. "We fight wars of armies, not men." In October 1945, the order came. The Special Air Service Regiment would be disbanded. The men received the news without ceremony. Some laughed. Others smashed their mugs against the wall. "So that's it then," muttered one sergeant. "From ghosts to ghosts again." Maine read the official communiqué aloud, then tore it in half. "They can close the regiment," he said, "but they can't kill what it stands for." His men raised their glasses, whiskey, gin, whatever they had, and drank to the memory of the raids, the brothers lost and the motto that had carried them through fire: "Who dares wins." When dawn came, the camp was gone. The tracks led outward in every direction, vanishing into the mist. Yet history has a way of preserving what paper tries to erase. In the late 1940s, as the world divided itself between East and West, the British Army realized that conventional warfare could no longer guarantee safety. The SAS, reborn in name at first, then in spirit, returned under a new badge, a phoenix risen quietly from its own ashes. Veterans of the desert were called back to train a new generation, younger men who had never seen the Sahara, who thought sabotage and survival were just words in a manual. Mayne declined the invitation. His war was over. But Sterling, ever the visionary, lent his counsel, shaping the regiment's rebirth from afar. He spoke of mobility, stealth, audacity, principles that had once been written not in doctrine but in the sand of North Africa. "You cannot train men to be ordinary," he said once, "and then expect them to do the extraordinary." For those who survived, life became a kind of exile. Mayne returned to his hometown of Newtownards in Northern Ireland, where the locals whispered of his heroism and pitied his solitude. He lived with his sister, read poetry, and drank too much. His temper was legendary, one moment jovial, the next volcanic, but his heart was still tethered to the desert. On quiet nights, neighbors said, he would stand outside and stare at the stars, whispering names they didn't recognize. In 1955, after years of restless nights and broken sleep, Mayne died in a car crash at 40. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered he'd driven too fast, chasing something that wasn't there anymore. At his funeral, veterans of the SAS stood shoulder to shoulder, the black beret and winged dagger stitched to their sleeves. Sterling sent a single wreath with a note. "For the bravest man I ever knew." Sterling lived longer, though time never dulled the restlessness in him. He turned his intellect to politics and business, but part of him always belonged to the sand. In interviews, he downplayed his legend, crediting his men instead. "I gave them the idea," he said once, "but they gave it life." In old age, his hands shook, but his eyes were still sharp, haunted by memory. When asked what he remembered most about the war, he didn't mention raids or victories. "The silence," he said softly. "The silence before an explosion, when you knew everything depended on one heartbeat." He died in 1990, far from the battlefield, but the desert wind might have been blowing that day, because those who knew him said he smiled at the end, the same quiet, dangerous smile he'd worn before every mission. And what of the regiment they left behind? The reborn SAS became the blueprint for modern special forces worldwide. Its ethos, audacity, initiative, resilience, was carried from the dunes of Libya to the jungles of Borneo, from the mountains of Oman to the streets of Belfast. Men trained in its methods would one day shape the future of warfare. Fast, silent, precise. The ghosts of Sterling and Mayne lingered in every mission, every parachute drop, every whispered order in the dark. In the Falklands, in Iraq, and Afghanistan, the same motto echoed, a challenge to the impossible. "Who dares wins" was no longer a slogan. It was a prophecy written in history's blood. But the true legacy of the SAS was not in medals or missions. It was in the kind of men it created. Soldiers who didn't see courage as the absence of fear, but as the mastery of it. Men who understood that daring was not recklessness, but the quiet decision to act when everyone else stood still. The SAS taught the world that wars are not won by numbers alone, but by conviction, by the few who refuse to be ordinary. And that idea, born in the furnace of the desert, spread across nations like a contagion of courage. Decades later, in the British Army Museum in London, there stands a small exhibit behind glass. A battered compass, a faded scarf, a sand-pitted Vickers gun, and a yellowed field order signed by D. Sterling. Beside it, a simple inscription reads, L Detachment, Special Air Service, North Africa, 1941-1943. Tourists pass by without understanding that these objects once changed the face of war. But sometimes when an old veteran limps past the display, he pauses. His eyes linger on the scarf or the compass, and for a heartbeat the years fall away. He remembers the heat, the roar, the laughter. He remembers friends who never came home. He remembers the ghosts. Outside, London moves on, cars, noise, life. But under the museum lights, the shadows of the SAS remain fixed in eternal motion, frozen between fear and fury. They are the embodiment of a truth that war itself never forgets. That sometimes the impossible only becomes real when someone dares to try. The modern soldiers who inherit their emblem, the winged dagger on a black beret. Wear it not as decoration, but as a reminder. Every victory begins with a decision to risk everything. And that decision, first made by a handful of men in the desert, still defines the edge between legend and oblivion. If you walk out into the Libyan sands today, to the place where Sterling first imagined the SAS, there is nothing left. The wind has erased the tire tracks, the forts have crumbled, the dunes have swallowed every trace of the jeeps. But if you listen closely in the twilight, when the air cools and the stars begin to rise, you can almost hear them, the distant growl of engines, the laughter of men who refuse to die quietly, the thunder of explosions echoing through the years. The desert keeps their secret. It remembers the ghosts who once dared it to fight back.